From the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, this is Trending Globally. I'm Dan Richards. It's hard to believe now that it was only 3 years ago that this happened.
A new artificial intelligence program called ChatGPT made its debut online. This project from the OpenAI research lab can write essays and carry on convincing written conversation.
And as we all can see now, the rollout of this new, powerful, widely accessible tool back in 2022, it wasn't the climax of the AI revolution. It was more like the starting gun.
Just this week, OpenAI unveiling its newest version, which can answer complex questions in seconds.
DALL-E 2 is artificial intelligence software that can turn anything you type into art.
We learned it can now even pass the bar exam.
OpenAI is only one of a handful of companies now pushing the boundaries of artificial intelligence. Every day, there's seemingly a new breakthrough and a new cause for concern.
Researchers have found that it sometimes invents text. It's what's known in the industry as hallucination.
As the technology gets better, deep fakes will be harder to spot.
This is a new oxygen of wartime preparation.
Yeah.
We are absolutely fully geared up to fight future battles with AI.
But as our guest on this episode explains,
there is a lot of conversation, and rightly so, in identifying the harms of AI. But I think it's important not to be scared of it.
Malika Saar is a human rights lawyer and senior fellow at the Watson Institute. Prior to Watson, she served as the head of global human rights for YouTube. And at the Watson Institute, she's leading a study group on the relationship between the rise of artificial intelligence and human rights. We talked about how her more traditional training in human rights law led to her work at one of the world's most powerful tech companies, and how her experience in both realms has affected her understanding of the promise and perils of artificial intelligence. Here is our conversation. Malika Saar, thank you so much for coming on to Trending Globally.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So before we get into talking about artificial intelligence more broadly and how it's shaping our society and what it all has to do with human rights, I was hoping we could maybe talk a little bit about your career, because I think that might give some insight into how we're thinking about it in this conversation. So before starting working in the tech world, you worked as a human rights lawyer. You founded Rights for Girls, a human rights organization that works to end gender-based violence. And so I guess before we even get to the tech and the AI of it all, what got you interested in working in human rights as a lawyer?
Well, I went to law school in the tradition of Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, and really thought that I wanted to understand, how do we use the law as an opportunity for impact and justice? And I got to law school, and there wasn't a lot of conversation around justice. And the classes and seminars that I did do that were focused on civil rights and justice made me realize that so much of civil rights law had been hollowed out. And I felt like there wasn't a path forward that was expansive and creative and intersectional and hopeful around civil rights law. And so I started to look at human rights law. And I loved the grounding concept of human rights law that, you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and it came out of the ashes of World War II. It came out of the realities and consequences of the power of the state to put its people into ovens. The recognition that there had to be a way of thinking that gave the individual inherent dignity, inherent rights. And so the UN Declaration of Human Rights as a practice and discourse, is grounded in the concept that by virtue of being alive, I have rights. By virtue of my humanness, I am worthy of dignity. And I was moved by that. And I also liked how human rights law and frameworks allowed us to be intersectional in identities and acknowledge that our rights are not only in the political sphere, but in the social, economic, and cultural.
And in 2015, you began working then at Google as a senior counsel for civil and human rights. When did you first start to really see a connection between what was happening in the world of tech and the world of human rights? I imagine it was before you started the job, but I wonder, when did that really kind of sink in for you?
Yeah, well, I always joke that I didn't become a human rights lawyer to work for Google.
Sure.
I became a human rights lawyer to fight for women and girls who were being subject to violence. And I had worked 15 years in that space of gender-based violence. Some of that work was about how our children were being bought and sold, how our children were being trafficked for sex. And those acts of exploitation didn't happen in back rooms, didn't happen on the street corner. They began online. And I remember that there were young women who had been trafficked as girls who sat with me and showed me how there were children being sold on Craigslist. They showed to me how this part of Craigslist that was supposed to be about dating, right, was being used as a platform by traffickers to put children up for sale. And that experience, and then all of the work that we did afterwards with survivor leaders, with individuals who had experienced online trafficking, led to recognizing that violence became digital. Also understanding that when we looked at harassment and stalking, that those were becoming cyber harassment, cyber stalking. And so that really changed my way of understanding who I was as a human rights lawyer working in the area of gender-based violence, what we now talk about as digitally enabled gender-based violence. We did the work with members of Congress to really think about how to better protect kids online from forms of what we call CSAM, child sexual abuse imagery, as well as child trafficking. Because of that work, Google recruited me to come help them be a better actor. And that was not an easy decision for me to make. I had never envisioned my work as a human rights lawyer being in corporate, let alone in the tech sector. But what I was fascinated by was Google's interest in how, in this emerging space of tech violence, how I could try to reshape tech policy and product development so that women and girls were safer online.
Are there any examples that you think might best illustrate the kind of work you did at Google? I think for a lot of people, it might be hard to even imagine. What is someone who's working in human rights at Google? What were the types of projects you were working on?
So we worked on issues of our supply chains and ensuring that child labor, child slavery was not part of those supply chains. We did the work with anti-trafficking advocates to make sure that we were scrubbing our platform of links to traffickers and groomers, ensuring that understanding mail order brides were being advertised on the platform, and that was a form of trafficking that had to be shut down. And content moderation. So I did 4 years on the Google side, and then I jumped over to the YouTube side and did that work of how do you take human rights frameworks and apply them to content moderation? How do we separate out what is free speech from hate speech? And how do you do that disaggregation of hate speech from free speech and apply that to community guidelines and enforcement? And then so much of what it means to be a human rights lawyer is to look at issues of non-discrimination, right? It is a human right not to be subject to discrimination. It is a human right to live free of that type of bias. And so much of my work at YouTube also extended to looking at how were we ensuring an equal experience for Black and brown and queer creators? How were we making sure that one community was not enjoying opportunities for monetization over other communities? How are we making sure that content that queer creators were putting out were not being wrongly shut down because of bias in the way that our algorithms were responding? So, the work of being a human rights lawyer in tech, I think, is very expansive, and you can get pulled in many different directions around how policy is done, but also how product design is done. And when tech companies bring on human rights lawyers to be part of those conversations around policy and product, it really is an opportunity to make sure that we are centering rights and dignity in the way that policy is developed and in the way that product design takes place.
And, at the time that you were working for YouTube and also for Google, I mean, I just can't imagine the issue, this is the late 20-teens and the 2020s, the fraught issues that were occurring on a societal global level, that were taking place on the platforms that you were working on. Were people at Google and YouTube at that point talking a lot about artificial intelligence and the role it was playing or about to play in their technologies, or had it not quite entered the mainstream conversation at this point?
Well, Google was doing really good work around setting up principles that would govern how AI was designed and developed and deployed at the company. But my everyday was not about AI. And all of that changed in November of 2022 when ChatGPT was introduced to the world. And then there was this seismic shift in the way that we did our work. And so all of that expertise that I had around human rights and international law became very relevant to AI. So we wanted to make sure that in the development of AI features, that there was an understanding of how to test for harm. So I was asked to map out, for example, what constituted harmful stereotyping and do a kind of socio-technical mapping out of stereotyping that informed adversarial testing. And that was a really wonderful experience of being able to repurpose my background to ensure that we weren't baking bias into these AI features. What I realized from that experience is that I could talk about harmful stereotyping all day in the US context, but I didn't know what constituted harmful stereotyping in South Asia. I didn't know the nuances of harmful stereotyping in the context of MENA and other underrepresented communities. So part of the work that I was able to do in that moment that everything changed around AI was thinking about how do we make sure that in India, for example, there was knowledge and subject matter expertise to inform what constituted gendered stereotyping and how that expertise could then drive and inform not just adversarial testing, but product design.
So I wonder if you could maybe map out an example just for listeners. I think a lot of people at this point are maybe familiar with something like ChatGPT. You can type a thing into a box and it gives you a text answer that sounds like a human wrote it. What are the ways that new type of AI technology could lead to human rights abuses, and how would your work then address that?
So there are questions like, if your input is, show me doctors in the United States, and the image of the doctors that made the output, the results that you got, were only white men. That is a human rights violation because it is a biased representation. If you don't have diversity in your outputs and you are not reflecting the world as it is and as we want it to be. If you put in, show me poverty in the United States, and again, you don't have a diverse output, then you are not showing the complexity of who we are. So those are some examples. But then there are also questions of, is every prompt desirable? So do you allow a prompt that is racist in its question? Do you allow a prompt that says, explain to me how eugenics was a favorable ideology? Explain to me how eugenics is true. So those are some of those really complicated issues around, do you create a technology that reproduces hate and bias or not? Do you allow these AI products to be trained on data that suffers from baked-in bias? There's this notion of garbage in, garbage out. If you train the algorithm on biased data, it will have biased outputs. And that becomes especially dangerous in the context of AI and these chatbots, where we do have a certain kind of deference to their omniscience, right? You know, I had a friend of mine was talking about her experience of using a chatbot to do research on disability legislation. She's a disability lawyer. She's been a disability lawyer for over a decade. And the responses that she was getting from the chatbot, she knew were wrong, right? It was hallucinating. And even though she has all this expertise, she felt uncomfortable questioning whether or not these were hallucinations, because there is a way that we are seeing ChatGPT or Gemini as these omniscient powers. So when we talk about outputs, right, that are biased, that reproduce racism and gendered stereotypes, and yet there's this deference to the chatbot as being something that's so powerful and omniscient. How does that create a situation where we are allowing hate and bias to take over in a manner that has authority and normalization?
In 2023, over 1,000 tech leaders co-signed a letter suggesting a one-year moratorium on AI research. They warned that AI tools represented a, quote, profound risk to society and humanity. Even Elon Musk signed on to that letter, but that recommendation ultimately, wasn't adopted. What did you make of that letter? Were the concerns overblown, or do you think that maybe would have been a good idea, that we're sort of losing control of this technology?
I mean, what I think is unfortunate is that we are in the context of an arms race around the technology. The companies are in that arms race with one another, and now countries are in that arms race, right? And so you hear whether it's leaders of the West or it's leaders of tech companies in the US argue that we have to win this arms race because that will determine who has the power. Well, that's true in terms of who has the economic power will be determined around who wins the arms race, which one of these companies has the upper hand. Will OpenAI win over Google? And that will determine who is more powerful economically. And then there's that question in terms of countries. Will the US win over China? The argument has been, if China wins over the US, then we will see the way in which AI is weaponized against human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. My concern is we lose the conversation around responsibility when it does have the tone and behavior of an arms race, and how we have created this false dichotomy that to be more innovative means we must innovate at the risk of responsibility and human rights. And I would argue that the best innovation comes out of a respect for responsibility and human rights. And all of the tech innovation that's happened around accessibility proves that out. The tech innovation that I saw when I was working on child exploitation and trafficking bears that out. How companies were able to come together and develop the technology of hashing so that we identified children who were being exploited across platforms was in of itself brilliant innovation.
What is hashing?
So it's essentially photo DNA. so that we would understand this one picture that was exploitive. Other similar images of that child were identified through this hashing. And so it was a way of trying to be able to stop and contain these horrible images of a child being hurt. I think there's so many ways in which you could see examples of how we become more powerful and innovative when we innovate from a place of rights and dignity. I think a lot of that is getting lost right now.
It seems like the idea of just pausing AI's development doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon. And this is something that's largely being led by the private sector. What role do you see the government playing in promoting human rights within this incredibly powerful technology?
I think the issue of AI governance has to be grounded in human rights frameworks. And the best approach of that has been what the EU is doing. So the EU AI Act is very clear in saying that there have to be these human rights-driven assessments of the technologies that are AI-driven technologies. So any type of AI-powered product or tool has to be subject to a human rights assessment. And if that AI-powered tool poses harm to individual rights, that has to be recognized, and there has to be a consequence to that. Now, it will be interesting to see what this looks like in actual implementation, but I do believe that is the direction we have to go in AI governance. It's been unfortunate to me that a lot of the discourse, certainly in the US around AI governance, has been more about responsibility and ethics and not in human rights.
And what's the problem there with grounding it in ideas of responsibility and ethics versus in human rights? And really sort of what's the difference between those?
And the reason why it's so important to push it in the context of human rights is that there's no reason to start all over again when we have over 7 decades of human rights jurisprudence and law. And it's exactly that structure and framework that needs to be applied to AI governance. Human rights is the closest thing we have to internationally agreed to norms. So it only seems right that we would take these internationally agreed to norms, this long history that has gone through decades of wrestling around what are human rights laws, these structures of courts that we've created, the ICC, the IJC, and apply all of that to how AI is developed, designed, and deployed. I think the reason why there's been a reluctance is, in fact, because it requires real accountability.
For people who are just consumers of this technology, which more and more of us are, and I think we're kind of in awe of and a little scared of, what do you recommend for how to think about or how to approach this technology as consumers in a way that is moving us all in the direction of promoting rights and justice and not feeding into more harmful uses of this technology?
I think that you look at our phones, right? Our phones are some of the greatest human rights tools, right? We know what happened in Syria and the abuses of the Saad regime because of our phones and the ability to capture human rights abuses and then share those abuses on global platforms. Or here at home, the courage of a Darnella Frazier to take out her phone and record the murder of George Floyd and then to share that content on global platforms. Our phones are human rights tools. There's no question that those tools can be weaponized against us. But it's so critical for us to understand that there are ways that these technologies have been used to promote human rights, and that this moment that we're in, which is the fourth industrial revolution, we have to make sure that human rights defenders understand the technology, can play with the technology, can work with technologists to really use and deploy this technology for our rights and dignity. And I think it's really upon foundations to help invest in creating those opportunities for NGOs, for human rights defenders to understand, to play with the technology, and to create partnerships with technologists so we see these kinds of outputs. Because there's so many ways that AI will be absolutely weaponized against us. There is a real slow violence to human rights that AI will pose. And at the same time, there is opportunity to take the technology and claim it as ours for human rights defense.
So don't be scared of it and keep an eye on how it can help us.
Absolutely. And I think it's important not to be scared of it, right? It's important to understand what the technology is. You know, I see college students very comfortable with the technology. They're using it to do their research. They're using it to help their writing. It's important that all of us be able to have curiosity about the technology and to be able to interact with it. Because if the fourth industrial revolution becomes technology that's only utilized by the few, it's very dangerous.
Malika, Saada, Saar, thank you so much for coming on to Trending Globally.
Absolutely. Thank you. My pleasure.
This episode was produced by me, Dan Richards, and Zach Hirsch, with production assistance from Eric Emma. Our theme music is by Henry Bloomfield. Additional music by the Blue Dot Sessions. If you like this show, leave us a rating and review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you haven't subscribed to Trending Globally, please do that too. If you have any questions or comments or ideas for guests or topics, send us an email at trendingglobally@brown.edu. Again, that's all one word, trendingglobally@brown.edu. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Trending Globally. Thanks for listening.